a red flag flying here.
Hello and welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today we are speaking to David Rosenberg. Hello, David.
Hello. I'm very glad to be here.
Oh, excellent. We're delighted to have you. So I'm going to go straight into the question that we always ask. What is socialism to you?
What is socialism to me? Well, it's an idea and it's a plan. And it's about how we ought to live locally and globally. To me, when I think about it, I sort of imagine a society that is based on friendliness, cooperation, where people's lives are not dominated by fears and stresses. And it's hard to imagine that, isn't it? It's hard to imagine people not having to say, can I pay the rent this month? Can I feed my kids? Will I keep my job? Who will care for me when I get old? Those are fears and stresses that are so much in people's lives. And in a way, I kind of feel that until we have quite a massive redistribution of wealth and power and a different set of priorities for what we want, focused on the common good, until then, it's going to be very hard to allay those fears and worries and to live as more free people, more fulfilled people. So to me, socialism is very much about giving people that support, that confidence in that their lives will be good and will be better. Yeah. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
It's really interesting that you talked about freedom there, because a lot of people think that maybe socialism is a set of rules that would restrict your freedom and so on. And the way you describe it there, it's like you've spoken about it like it's a support mechanism to allow you to have the freedoms that you deserve as a human being. Is that about right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's you can talk about freedom all you want, but if you're sort of falling down all the time, or if there's things oppressing you, exploiting you, it's very hard to be free. Freedom is a great idea, and I think we need a society which has those kind of really strong support mechanisms in place, and then that will allow people to actually flourish. I've always been, well, I suppose, something more of what you might call a libertarian socialist. Libertarian ideas have always been very important to me. I don't like particularly following orders. And so my idea of socialism is one that really is about a lot of freedom, but it's freedom. But in order to be free and to make the most of that, we also have to have a much more equal society.
It's a really interesting situation for me, where we have libertarians as a political kind of idea, a right-wing libertarian, where they think of, so what's the difference between sort of a right-wing libertarian and a libertarian socialist, do you think?
Okay, so the libertarians of the right, a lot of their libertarianism is like freeing up the market for everything, having a very small state, and just capitalism being able to run rampant in the hope that somehow that people will be able to satisfy their needs through that. But to me, capitalism as a system is one that tends very much to making the rich richer and the poor poorer. I mean, I understand the idea about not wanting to have lots of oppressive rules and regulations. Yeah, and I've always reacted against that myself. But to me, a left-wing libertarianism is about everyone having a voice. It's about democracy not just being something you do every 5 years when you vote. It's about democracy in everyday life. It's about When I was a school teacher in primary school, and I was teaching. My happiest times were teaching like 7 and 8 year olds, um, and I would say to them, we would talk about things like how democracy works, what is a government, the children that come we'd invite our local MP in, and I was teaching in Islington South, where Emily Thornberry was the MP, and she still is. And I would invite her in every so often to come and talk to the kids, 6, 7, 8, 9 year olds, about ideas about democracy. And she was very, very good, very talks very directly to them. And then we'd follow that up, and the kids would say to me, "But I'm too young to vote." And I say, "Well, yeah, you won't get the vote till you're 18, although maybe before then they'll drop it down to 16. But you can write a letter to the paper now. You can express an opinion about something that you don't think is right or you don't think is fair, and you can do that now. You can do that, at 6 years old, at 7 years old, if you like." So my idea of, is very much about people feeling they've got a meaningful voice and being able to express that. I think we learn a lot through being able to think more freely.
As a fellow teacher, solidarity to you there, and that sounds a really lovely thing to do. So how do you feel then about the recent news? I'm not sure if you've heard that or not, but about not being able to teach things that would be that would suggest capitalism should come to an end in schools. There was a new piece of guidance put in from the DFE. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, and it was slipped in the what they call it, health. What do they call it now? Personal health education. No, I think this is a very direct attack on teachers' ability to talk to young people about things that are actually very, very important to them. And I think I know who it was aimed at, because it wasn't just about capitalism as an idea, talking about that. It talked about organizations that could be regarded as extremists, and I saw that as being aimed at XR, the Extinction Rebellion, the environmental movement. I saw it being aimed at Black Lives Matter, both of which, in a lot of the sort of mainstream and right-wing press, have been characterized as extreme organizations. But I also know that Nelson Mandela was called by those newspapers for many years an extremist, a terrorist. These are important things. And the Black Lives Matter campaign has been so important in the last year, and people have finally started to talk about decolonizing the curriculum, getting to grips with teaching history in a way that tells you about empire, that tells you about colonial rule. How can you teach that without saying something about the economic underpinning of empire? To me, it's really wrong. And I think schools should be a place where kids' minds should be able to sort of move about, freely, to sort of make connections, think laterally. I say this also as somebody who put a resolution through our NEU branch, National Education Union branch, opposing that piece of legislation and actually calling on our local authority to say to schools, look, that piece of legislation it clashes with common sense, and we want you to think about how you would approach this.
I think if capitalism were so strong, it should be able to defend itself through ideas rather than legislate against any ideas that would say that it wasn't a particularly great idea. So you've obviously been a socialist for a long time. What inspired you to become a socialist? Was this something you grew up with? Did you always identify with the word socialism, or was did that come later?
It's an interesting. I would say my family and kind of community roots are definitely part of that. I mean, my family on my mum's side were Jewish immigrants from Poland and Ukraine. Her parents came as children to Britain in the early 1900s, and they were struggling working class people all their life, my grandparents. My mum grew up in this working class family. They were solid Labour voters, Labour supporters. You know, that was kind of natural to them. My granddad, who was mainly more interested in the betting shop than politics, but whenever an election came round, he'd always say, we've got to vote Labour, Labour are the party of the working man, sort of thing. You know, it was kind of very natural, that association coming from my mum's side. My dad grew up in a very similar family, but in Toronto, Canada. His parents also had come from Poland and Ukraine. They got to Toronto, and in the 1950s, when my mum was a bit fed up with her work in the East End, she was doing secretarial work, and she saved up whatever money she could. She had an aunt who'd gone to live in Toronto, and she went to visit her and basically met my dad and married him 8 weeks later, and a few months later dragged him back to the East End to live with her family. But my dad, what the values I got from him were particularly a kind of support for the underdog. That was a really crucial idea for him, and particularly that related to the underdogs who were underdogs because of their ethnicity. Yeah, and people were being racially discriminatory towards them. He felt very strongly about that. He was also a real egalitarian. You know, for him, whatever class people thought they were, if they thought they were upper class or lower class or where they were in the hierarchy, he treated them all as if they're all on the same level. He, using a very Canadian way, he used to call all of them buddy. He'd say hello buddy to when somebody, if they were sort of Lord so-and-so, or whether there was sort of somebody really struggling in poverty. You know, they were for him, they were all on the same level, all the same value. And that's something that I kind of imbibed quite a lot. I was, you know, I think about when I could trace my first political opinions, and one of them was about supporting the underdog. The other one was reflecting on my immigrant background, if you like, you know, because in terms of my mum and dad and grandparents, only my mum was born here in Britain. Yeah. My dad's parents, I didn't know. His mum died young and his dad died the year that I was born. His dad died in Canada when I was born in London. But my grandparents on my mum's side, I spent quite a lot of time with them when I was young, so my mum grew up in the East End of London, and she was born in 1928. In the 1930s, the fascists, British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley, they were really strong in that period, and they made the East End their kind of power base, just in the area right next to where the Jewish community were living. And my mum's family had moved a little bit out of the main concentration of where the Jews were living to Bethnal Green, which was more on the border with the fascist territory. And in fact, where they lived, the British Union of Fascist headquarters were just round the corner to where they lived. So when she was 8, 9, 10 years old, there'd be a lot of fascists around. In her school, she was the only Jewish girl in her class and used to get a lot of anti-Semitic abuse. But my granddad, he was ducking and diving in terms of his work. He never had a skilled job in his life. He worked from when he was 14 to when he was 81. But he used to do boxing in his youth, and before I learned to ride a bike, I knew about the British Union of Fascists because he'd told me about how he'd punched this black shirt and that black shirt, you know. So that was part, you know, anti-fascism was part of that family story. And my dad in Canada, he'd had similar skirmishes with the fascists. But what I got from growing up around my grandparents on my mum's side quite a lot was that their immigrant background. And to me, yeah, one of my first political ideas, apart from supporting the underdog, was also a kind of an idea that why are there borders between countries? You know, why shouldn't people be able to move wherever they want in the world? And it was a kind of pro-immigrant, pro-refugee point of view I had when I was like 11, 12 years old. You know, that in a way was I think that was my first political ideas. But when I was about 15, 16, I was at school, not doing terribly well at school at that point, but some of my close friends who came from very similar backgrounds, we started to talk about political issues, and this was in the mid-1970s. And I went on my first anti-fascist demonstration around 1975, 76, as a teenager. And I got my next few years, it was very full of anti-racism and anti-fascism. And when you're sort of very involved in that, you then step back for a moment and you say, but why is there racism? And what kind of society might need to come into being to eliminate racism? So in a way, I think my journey towards socialism was also very influenced by those very sharp issues, it seemed, in London in that period around racism and fascism.
That is such an incredible inspirational story there, background story. So thinking about all that and thinking about that rich history you've got in your family, so how can that rich history and how can that radical history help to inspire socialist campaigners today?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been very interested in communities that have settled in London, the struggles they have, partly because of that family background. But there were certain things that happened from, I'd say, the late 70s and early 80s that kind of helped me went on this journey towards getting a really, really deep interest in radical history. And in the end, being able to use that radical history today to convey knowledge and ideas, but also hopefully inspire people in struggles today. So in the late 1970s, I went to university. I was at Leeds University for 3 years. And during my time there, I was involved with various left-wing groups around the university, also anti-racist and anti-fascist groups. We used to go down to Leeds football ground. If there were more of us than the fascists, the police would move the fascists on. If there were less of us, they'd move us on. But also in that period, I came into contact with some people in Manchester in a group called the Jewish Socialist group. And I went over from Leeds to Manchester a few times to go to meetings, find out what they were about. And I was 18, 19 at the time. There were these people who were in their late 50s and 60s who had set up this thing called the Jewish Socialist Group that seemed to bring together quite a number of things, you know, my socialist ideas that I was developing, but also my Jewish identity, which was also important to me. Not a kind of religious Jewish identity, but a kind of secular, cultural Jewish identity. But these people who were in their late 50s and early 60s, they would tell me stuff about what they were doing when they were my age. You know, I mean, they cut their teeth politically in the fight against poverty and fascism in the 1930s. They were mainly active in either the Communist Party or the Labour Party. and had been for most of their lives. And I just kind of got really interested in kind of older generations of people and what they have done in the past, what struggles have gone on before the struggles that we're engaging in today. And then when I was back in London after I finished university, and I wasn't sure what to do next, really, I ended up driving a van for 3 years. And it was almost the best job in the world, because I was driving a van delivering radical literature to political and community bookshops. And the company I was working for were called Central Books, and they were the book distribution company of the Communist Party. There was a time when you had to be a member of the Communist Party to get a job there. I wasn't in the Communist Party, but they'd relaxed that rule because it just dawned on them one day that actually being an admirer of Stalin didn't necessarily give you a good work ethic. And actually, so they spread their net a bit wider. And then I was working as a van driver. I was also the shop steward there. And I have to tell you, they knew every trick in the capitalist book, because they've been so involved with industrial struggles. When they were the employers, they knew how to work things from the other side, and I was in battle with them. But in that 3 years that I was there, again, I met so many interesting people, particularly people quite a bit older than me, who had been part of political struggles in the past. So I kind of got very interested in reading up on that history. Then very soon after that, I read a fantastic book by a guy called Bill Fishman. And Bill Fishman, he came from a similar family background to me, but a generation on before. His family were immigrant tailors. He was one of about 10 children, and I think only 2 of them got any kind of higher education. And he ended up teaching in a university in East London as a historian. And what he did is he noticed that the other people there were dealing in history far away in time and space from East London. And he thought, there's all this history right on our doorsteps, because the East End of London was London's first industrial area. It's where a lot of the major industrial battles took place in the 1800s, 1900s. And also it was the immigrant quarter of London. And so there were lots of kind of big struggles there for immigrant groups to establish themselves against quite a bit of hostility. And he wrote a book called East End Jewish Radicals, set in the 1870s to the First World War, and which was just a most amazing book. But even better than the book, he used to do walks, guided walks. And a group of us from the Jewish Socialists in London arranged for him to take us on a walk. And we spent 2 hours walking around the East End with this guy who, it was like ghosts coming to life. He would tell us, this is the place where so-and-so gave this speech. This is the place where they had this demonstration. This is the place where they fought this fascist, I mean, and he told it in such a brilliant way that you could just picture these people, these events. And I was really personally inspired by that. And that really stayed with me. And it must have been sort of late 1990s, maybe early 2000s, that I started to think, well, actually, I could do a walk like that, because I'd gathered quite a lot of kind of knowledge of it. And Bill Fishman himself, he was doing fewer and fewer walks. He was getting old, and his wife was telling him, Bill, you got to stop soon. And eventually he did. He collapsed on a walk, and his wife said to him, that's it. You're not doing any more. Although he did live on till he did his last walk when he was about 85 years old. He lived till he was in his early 90s. And I wrote his obituary actually in The Guardian. So that's one to look up, Bill Fishman. But yeah, so I remember it kind of happened a bit by accident that I there was some campaign I was part of, and I can't even remember which campaign it was, but they needed to raise about £150 for a particular initiative. And I said, and they didn't want to do something that was like another pub quiz or something like that. They wanted something a bit out of the ordinary as a fundraiser. And I said, what about if I do a walk of radical East End history? And they said, yeah, and we charge people a minimum amount. They can give more if they want. And all the money goes to the campaign. And people said, yeah, that'd be really good. And I didn't even have a walk at that point, but I had one in my head. So then I constructed the walk, partly based on stuff I'd learned from Bill Fishman and partly my own research. And so the first walks that I did, every few months or so in that period, I was doing a benefit for a different campaign or group that I quite appreciated, you know, the cause that they were fighting for. And then I kind of thought I really liked doing this. By now I was also a primary school teacher. I was involved quite a lot with history projects with the kids, and I cut down my days eventually in school so that I could start to develop doing work as a radical tour guide, walking guide. And so from 2007, I kind of did it in a more systematic way. I started out with one walk. I've now got 15, and I've written a book on it called Rebel Footprints, which has got full of maps, and people can do walks themselves from it. But the people that came on those walks, they would add to whatever narrative I gave, they would add to it with stories from their families, things that they had heard, things that they knew about. And it was fantastic. And you could see they were really kind of engaged with it. And they would tell me things, you know, this is brilliant, and I want to research this, and I want to find out more about that. And they could see the lines being drawn between struggles that had gone before and struggles from today. Yeah. And so in a way, that's I approach these walks very much now as an educational tool, but also I really hope I can inspire people to be part of struggles today, but also recognize the kind of sacrifices along the way that people have made, you know, whose shoulders we stand on when we're sort of campaigning for various things today.
That is absolutely fascinating that you do that. I'm really interested to know, have you got any favorite stories that you like to tell in a location? Maybe one that maybe someone could get a little bit of interest in this topic for.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I think my favorite walk out of all the walks that I do is one called Anti-Fascist Footprints, and that follows the story of fascism in Britain from the 1920s and 30s, and particularly how it came to focus so much on the East End. And in the East End, we've got a kind of an amazing prop that is there, which is the Cable Street mural. 1936, the Battle of Cable Street, the iconic clash between fascism and anti-fascism. It happened there in the East End, and people in the 1970s, on the 40th anniversary of the battle, they commissioned a piece of artwork on the side of a building, and it is just it's an amazing piece of political art. You know, it's the kind of mural that when you're standing there looking at it, you can almost hear it. You can almost hear what people are shouting, what people are saying. But I've had people come on my walk who tell me about the experiences of their parents and grandparents. Somebody who's been on my walk is the daughter of somebody who was arrested on the day and served 3 months in prison and then went to fight in Spain against Franco. You know, you learn all these kinds of stories, so that, yeah, when I do that walk, I always get lots of personal stories from people who have these family stories that have come down about what their family did on the day of the Battle of Cable Street. There's also, I suppose, another one that's very popular is I do a walk that is about the East London suffragettes, who were a very radical section, politically radical section of the suffragette movement, but were almost entirely working class and very different from the kind of received image we have, which is mainly of central London suffragettes with big hats and long wide dresses, if you like, and the sash of the suffragette movement. And the women in the East End suffragettes, they were mainly factory workers, cleaners, laundry workers, barmaids. That was the jobs they were doing. There was a handful of middle-class activists among them, including Sylvia Pankhurst, the middle sister of the Pankhurst family, who went to live in the East End. But I combined that one with what happened in the decade after the suffragettes in that area, because the bit of the East End they were in is a place called Poplar. And in Poplar in the 1920s, you had a really radical Labour council that it won 39 out of 42 seats at the local election in 1919. Although you kind of imagine that if Laura Kunsberg existed then, she'd say it was a disappointing result for Labour. But they didn't get all 42. but there you had a radical council that actually led by George Lansbury, who said at his first council meeting of the new council, look, he didn't want the mayor's chain or any of that paraphernalia. He says, look, we are all clear class conscious socialists here, and we are going to change things for working class people in this borough. And and the things that they did were very remarkable. And again, I've had people who come on the walk who just remember with great affection some of those names that I mentioned on that walk, and they've said things to me. Oh, she used to live down our road, and that was talking about a laundry worker who later who was a suffragette, then a Poplar councillor, went to prison in the Poplar Rates Revolt of 1921, and then later in the 1940s was mayor of Poplar. It's so it's kind of very exciting, and people's response to it is they come back for more, and I know that some of those people have engaged more in activism. I also I do some adult education teaching based on these walks. In London, we've got a place called the City Lit, which is it's the largest adult education provider, and it's mainly courses that then you don't take qualifications in it. They're people learning for learning's sake. And I've been doing a course called In the Footsteps of London's Rebels there over the last few years, a 12-session course, mainly with 10 walks in it and a couple of classroom sessions. And the very first class I had, when we'd done all the walks out and we came back for a classroom session to kind of draw that history together. And the people on that, it was a daytime course. It tended to be older people, semi-retired or retired. And some of them obviously politically to the left. The course kind of attracted that, but also others just more generally interested in London history. And there was one woman there who never said a word in any of the sessions, but was listening really attentively. And when we had that session at the end and we were going round saying what we learned from it, and I asked them a question, what do you think you'll do next? What do you want to do next, having learnt about this? And this woman, who hadn't spoken, she says, I want to start a revolution. And, and it was an amazing moment, but those end of course sessions have been really interesting over the years when I've been teaching this course. It's you know, people seem to become a little bit more radical along the way. You know, I had one person on my course there who was some sort of baron or earl or something like that, and his granddad had been a very right-wing Tory MP, and I was kind of careful sometimes about what I said to sort of, you know, he might think, God, that's extreme, sort of thing, you know. But he used to get very excited when in a positive way, when I mentioned anarchists, I noticed. So I don't know, it's, you know, and people have said to me, I just didn't know about these things that happen. We didn't learn it at school, you know, about these things that happened in localities in London. We learned about kings and queens. We learned about First World War, Second World War, and Tudors and Victorians, you know, and so it, you know, to me it's a terrible thing that we don't know enough about our history, and because of the way in the last decades, I mean, I don't know what it is like in your area, but gentrification, things just being knocked down, new blocks going up. In London, it's usually banks and financial houses, luxury flats, and some student accommodation. You know, not much else goes up, but they knock down bits of history, you know, and sometimes when I want to show people things, it's not there the next time I go there, you know. You know, it's changed. But yeah, that's the kind of thing that goes on with these, and I've gradually been getting a younger audience as well. And some of the people involved with the Occupy movement a few years ago, they were starting to come on my walks, and they were also organising some of their own walks. So it's, yeah, very multi-generational, and I feel it's contributing something to politicising or deepening people's political commitments, because they can see that they're part of a longer stream of radical struggle, if you like.
Those are all absolutely fascinating stories, and I can tell you now, we aren't building anything where I am. Nothing ever gets built here, so
yeah, I don't know Sedgefield. I've not been there. You know.
Yeah, well, I'm the Coalfield area, like kind of Wingate, and that's where I am. And very little gets built around here in the villages and towns, and there's just nothing going on whatsoever. And our heritage kind of rots a little bit. And a lot of people are trying to do good things to try. We've got like the Durham Miners Association and the Women's Banner Group, and people like that trying to educate people, which is positive. But we definitely need more of this. So, do you feel like, you know, these stories that you're talking about, they're almost like modern folk tales of people's actual, like, people like them, people who can be relatable, and people who have lived lives that are similar to them, who've done incredible things. Why do you think there's such a resistance to these stories? Because I think we kind of had a bit of a swell of interest in these kind of stories in 2017, and I can see sort of like the establishment pushing back against these stories, and actually no, don't say anything bad about the Queen. You know, that's the only important thing. Why do you think that happens?
I don't know. I mean, certainly the whole, what's happened to the history curriculum in schools. I mean, the way I describe it sometimes is because I was writing my book Rebel Footprints while I was still teaching, before I took early retirement, and I describe it as like there was this vandal. There was this vandal in my classroom who was called Michael Gove, you know, who was tearing up the history curriculum to make it a narrower curriculum, to make it a very empire-friendly curriculum, and sort of one our island story, you know, and you know, it just and it. Although he did have a little bit of a interest in local history. And I get a few days a year still where I do some teaching in an adult education institute, teacher training institute, to teach people that are becoming teachers and teach them how to teach history in primary schools. And one of the things I teach them is to yes, you have to teach the national curriculum, but there's much more you can teach. And Michael Gove, when he was the minister, put in this stuff about local history, and you can ask some really interesting questions about local history. If you look in the national curriculum, there's some very dull suggestions about what you could do in your locality. But you know, I sort of throw in things like the role of kind of immigrants in our area over the last few hundred years, and the fight for women's rights in this area, and you know, all these kind of things. And so I suggest them lots of kind of questions to follow up with their classes that can actually sort of where you have got that little loophole, a little bit of freedom within the national curriculum. And these students that I'm teaching, they're a very diverse group, you know, many different ethnicities, and the schools they're going to be teaching in London are also very, very diverse. And you know, you've got to make it relevant to the people, the children that are in your classroom. I also try and suggest to them, you know, that for example, if you're teaching about the fire of London, don't start in 1666. Bring in the local newspaper, find a fire that happened last week, a report of a fire and how it was dealt with, and then go back. Well, what would have happened 100 years ago trying to deal with this? What would happen 200 years ago? And so you'd find out through that, well, why do we have firefighters? When did the fire service start? You know, what's it like to be a firefighter? You know, and you could sort of, you know, look at a whole sort of range of issues. So I kind of so I try and sort of teach kind of progressive way of teaching history. You can actually go through all of primary school now and not get beyond 1066 if you're not careful. You know, which seems to me terrible, because you know, I think if kids are turned off history at that point, it's not that easy to recover that enthusiasm for it. And so for me, well, I'm a sort of big advocate of you know, history as a really important subject in schools.
So before we started the official part of this, we talked about like what I would say at the end, and I always ask people, what are your hopes for the future? And we were a little bit dubious about how enthusiastic we would be, but I knew, speaking to you, that I would be inspired. So I'm feeling inspired at the moment. I'm absolutely loving this. So I'm going to guide you a little bit in this direction, and I'm going to say, how can we use that kind of storytelling narrative about our past, about the great battles that people who are maybe working class or from immigrant backgrounds, or, you know, how can we use that history to inspire a generation of people to make a better future? Yeah,
I think there's a very interesting thing about struggles that look a bit like each other. You know, I mean, I know that Karl Marx said about history repeating itself. He says it's the first time it repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. I actually go with, not with Karl Marx, but with Mark Twain, who says that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think it's more like that, because you know, each struggle also takes place in its own time with its own dynamics, but you can hear echoes, and you can see things that link together. So for example, one of my walks that I do is about the suffragettes in Westminster, as well as the East End suffragettes. I also do one around Parliament, and I tell people about a demonstration that happened in 1910, where there was a suffragette in a wheelchair who had been disabled from when she was a few months old, who got treated terribly by the police, who were very brutally policing that demonstration. And then I sort of told people about, do you remember a few years ago there were student demonstrations, 2010, and there was a guy called Jody McIntyre who had cerebral palsy, and he was pulled out of his wheelchair and arrested, and you had almost the same scenario, and almost 100 years to the day that it happened. So whether you do it from the past to the present or the present to the past, you can relate those struggles. You can look at methods for demonstrating and protesting and methods of policing. I tell people on one of my walks about a demonstration that happened in 1833, where the government had banned a demo, but they hadn't followed the correct procedure, so the people demonstrated anyway, and about 3,000 people were gathered in a field. About 3,000 police come along and they kettled the demonstrators. And people think, oh, kettling, that's just a recent thing. And I say, no, it goes back to at least the 1830s, you know. And so you can find all these parallels, but I think what people find, well, what people are inspired by, but they don't find it that easy to kind of see how we can rebuild this, is that collective struggles. You know, today we're doing a lot of our politics online. You know, we connect with each other online, but in those days, you know, people actually did collectively come together in places. You know, they actually, you know, there were kind of mass movements, there were kind of industrial, there were strikes, there were mass protests, and a lot of that politics actually took place on the streets. And, you know, it's, I think people do get very inspired by that. And also when I tell them about the individuals involved, some of them, like the Dockers leader, Ben Tillett, the gas workers leader, Will Thorne, between them, they had about 2 years of schooling, you know, where they were working from when they were really young. Will Thorne didn't learn to read or write till he was 25 years old, but he was a union leader before that. You know, he was a great orator. He actually learned to read. He was taught to read and write by Eleanor Marx, who was Karl Marx's youngest daughter, who was working closely with the unions in East London. So, yeah, I think kind of learning about those people's lives, it kind of that I don't know. I do feel that there's, you know, people get very interested in that, but it is really hard to think about, well, how can we kind of start to replicate that? It's also, you know, the whole management of protests. In some ways, when I talk about the suffragettes to people, they bring up Extinction Rebellion. And that's interesting because to me, there is a kind of link there. Extinction Rebellion often use the same spaces that the suffragettes use in and around the Houses of Parliament, the streets around there, but they keep the authorities guessing. They're very unpredictable, you know, and they're very imaginative, and so I sort of encourage those people to sort of see those connections. I think there's loads that we can learn from the past, but we also have to, recognize that we're in, a more, I don't know, it's, the police have had a few decades to learn their tactics for sort of stifling protests, but we have to sort of somehow recover that imagination and the courage that people had. You know, it's I'm not saying people should go along to a protest and not worry at all about personal safety, but they have to recognize that sometimes, being on protest, there are kind of risks associated with it. But if you've got kind of support people around you, if you've got, that's a very important part of the way we're sort of organizing for change. So I suppose what I'm really trying to do is put the past and the present in conversation with each other. That's if you like my kind of key goal around this, I suppose. And to me, environmental movements have been quite inspiring in recent years. Sometimes there's moments when the anti-racist and anti-fascist movement is very inspiring, but it's also can be very divided and sectarian. I think that's one of the problems we have. But I think we're going to need to have vibrant protest movements in the years to come, because when we come out of the whole COVID situation, we're going to emerge into a terrible economic crisis where unemployment is going to really rocket. And we know from our history, what kind of forces get strong when you've got a lot of hopelessness, a lot of unemployment, a lot of people either blaming themselves or blaming other certain groups, for that situation. And I sort of worry that our kind of the kind of mainstream parties and the Labour Party, centrist politics are not going to cut it in that situation. I just think the Labour Party does need to recover a more radical programme if it's going to be able to offer something really meaningful to people, to inspire them and to be part of a positive movement for change. So I worry about what's going to happen in the next few years.
I love the way you've been talking about the way stories bring people together, really, don't they? And there's so much to be learned about how much in common people have and different struggles. And I know that kind of my heritage is mixed English and Irish, and but there are a lot of common struggles on both sides of that. And then I can see the links with like immigrants from different areas of the world, whether that's Africa, whether that's Jewish people, whether that's people from Asia and so on. And I think maybe those stories can help us share a history in a way while relating it in the way you said, like it's not exactly the same, but they rhyme. I really like that idea.
And I'll tell you a very kind of key moment that brought a lot of this together was 2016. It was the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Cable Street. And I'd been quite involved with the 75th commemoration. And when the 80th came round, somehow it got decided that I would be the overall convener for this event we were doing. And it was an event that involved a march and two rallies, one at the beginning, one at the end. We started the march. We had our initial rally in a park in the East End called Altab Ali Park, which is, I believe, the only park. It's a small green space, the only green space in Britain that is named after a Bengali. It was named after Altab Ali, who was a 24-year-old immigrant clothing worker who was stabbed to death in a racist attack in 1978. So we started there to make the link with the Bengali history. We ended up by the Cable Street Mural, just round the corner to the Cable Street Mural in a park there, to really bring together the 1930s history. And as we were marching, we organised it such that we had Irish groups, Jewish groups, Bengali groups, all kind of at the front of that march, recreating, if you like, the kind of encounters with racism and fascism through the 20th century in that area, and the alliances that were made. Because on the day of the Battle of Cable Street, although the fascists had tried to make big inroads into the Irish community to win them against the Jews, there was a lot of Irish people on the day who came and helped the Jews build barricades and united with the Jews against the fascists, particularly dockers and railway workers. And so it kind of came together in that event. And we also had a Yiddish marching band near the front as well, playing songs from the 1880s. You know, when the early Jewish immigrants came, and those early Jewish immigrants wrote some very good Yiddish socialist songs. But we also had kind of people young and old. We had people who's had family that were involved with the Battle of Cable Street. We had a lot of young anti-racist, anti-fascist, and the platform that we had, the platform of speakers at either end of the rally, it was a very multicultural platform. We had trade unionist speakers, a mixture of white and black trade unionists. We had some of the politicians, the local MP, Rushnara Ali, was there, Dawn Butler was there. And at the final rally, and this was 2016, our final speaker was Jeremy Corbyn, who gave a brilliant speech. It was his first outdoor event after the leadership challenge of Owen Smith, you know. That had happened the result of that had happened the week before, and Corbyn was confirmed as a leader with a very strong mandate. But that was his first kind of outdoor event. But he gave such a powerful speech that day, and he talked about where he had heard about Cable Street, and he says, and he heard it from his mum, who was actually there on the day as part of the demonstration in 1936. And he's somebody, I've known him personally for about 30 years. And we have these fleeting conversations about radical history, and because he's very interested in all of that, that kind of the struggles that have been along the way, and honouring those people who have been part of those struggles. We also talk about his vision for education in the future. In fact, we passed a resolution the other night in our NEU branch to invite him. It was a resolution of solidarity with him when he's under attack, but also to invite him to come to an NEU meeting in Islington, where I am very soon, to talk about the current political crisis, but also to talk about his own views about radical education. And I'm sort of really looking forward to when that happens.
David, I'm going to end it there because it was a real high, a really good point to end on. So I'm going to thank you for what has been a really inspirational talk for me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's been great to do this.
Excellent. Well, you know, it's all about making sure that people can hear the stories, and I think that's what we've done today. I think we've kind of allowed you to tell your stories, and I hope they inspire some people, because that's what we need at the moment, isn't it? A bit of inspiration.
Yeah, we do definitely.
Keep the red flag flying.